2140 to get more information. I don't know. I suppose for me, when I read about history and great tragedies, for some reason, the many burnings of the great library of Alexandria, leaving us with nothing. They say there were another 120 plays by Aristophanes. Can you imagine? Another 120 plays by Aristophanes that we will never see. Whoever it was who set those fires, and everyone now believes it was the same person. I don't believe in the death penalty, and I'm not suggesting it now, but I'm sure there must be some wonderful thing that we as a civilized nation could devise for someone who would burn ideas, who would burn books, who would callously and casually deny generations the wisdom they need simply to get through the day. Let me tell you what's coming up in the weeks that are going to follow. After tonight, which is October 31st, and you're all at home and the children are not going to soap your windows, next week, I want you to be here for Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons, the author of Song of Kali, one of the most astonishing novels I have ever read, and a memorable book. Dan will be doing an autograph party on November 8th at Dangerous Visions, and we'll be signing his book, which will then be out in a Tor paperback. If you want to get it beforehand, before the Tor paperback is out, get a hold of the hardcover. It's one of those books you'll want to keep. And there aren't that many of them around. It was done by Blue Jay. Dan Simmons here next week. Now, the World Fantasy Convention, the World Fantasy Awards, are being given out even as we sit here listening to each other. And Dan Simmons is up for that award. If he wins for Song of Kali, it will be an amazing coup because it's a first novel, and that's never happened with the World Fantasy Awards. November 14th, Linda Strawn-Beauvais does a 2-hour Future Watch with special guests. November 21st, Somtal Susharitko will be doing that long-awaited SF music show. I keep telling you to bring your earplugs, wet that cotton and put it in your head. You're going to hear 2 hours of music unknown to mortal people. On November 28th, Greg Bear. Greg Bear, the author of Eon, the author of Blood Music, fascinating guy, terrific writer. We will be having one of our silly conversations. December 5th, that is if I'm back from New York in the lawsuit. What lawsuit? Don't ask. If I'm back from the lawsuit on December 5th, you'll have Phil Folio, who was the artist on Myth Adventures and is doing the new Dynamo Joe comic. One of the funniest people you will ever listen to, a genuinely witty person. I've described to you before the difference between humor and wit. Everybody, you hear people on the dating game, and invariably they say, well, I want somebody with a good sense of humor. My friends, everything on this planet has a sense of humor. Chairs, sticks, doors, cockroaches, dogs, cats, they all have a sense of humor. They all know that the universe is basically absurd, as Camus told us. It is wit that makes the difference, and wit is in such short supply. Come and hear Phil Folio, a witty person, on December 5th. There will also be a Future Watch at the last half hour with Linda Strawn-Beauvais. December 12th, Harry Harrison, author of West of Eden. Well, his new Eden book, which I believe is called Winter in Eden, that will be out, and Harry will be here. And Harry Harrison is a force of nature. Harry Harrison is to humanity as the Grand Canyon is to holes you dig in your backyard. Harry Harrison is I am without words. I know this is awesome, but I am in fact without words. Also, he's barely able to be understood. He's unintelligible. Harry gets talking so fast. He's all, hello, this is Harry Harrison talking about, and I'm not talking about. So I will spend my entire time during the program keeping Harry from talking too fast. We got nothing yet for December 19th, December 26th, or January 2nd, but on January 9th, Peter S. Beagle, author of The Last Unicorn, I see by my outfit, or is it I see by your outfit? I don't know, I always get confused with that. He will be here, and his new book will be out. His new book, I guess it's the first book in 10 years by Peter Beagle. Fascinating guy, and you will enjoy that. Now that's what's coming up. We've been talking for very few minutes here, so I think I have the time to read you a wonderful little item. There's a book out now called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales. It's published by Summit Books in New York, and the author is Oliver Sacks. And Oliver Sacks is called by the New York Times Book Review one of the great clinical writers of the 20th century. And in his first book, Awakenings, he recounted the life stories of 20 patients, all afflicted by a single, though extraordinary, disease. In this new book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales, he casts his net even wider and explores a greater variety of neurological disorders, all manner of aberrations and aphasia and such like. You will understand why I find this particular item singularly wonderful. This is Chapter 9, and I'm not going to read it all, but it's called The President's Speech. It goes like this. What was going on? A roar of laughter from the aphasia ward just as the president's speech was coming on, and they had all been so eager to hear the president speaking. There he was, the old charmer, the actor, the great communicator, with his practiced rhetoric, his histrionisms, his emotional appeal, and all the patients were convulsed with laughter. Well, not all. Some looked bewildered, some looked outraged, one or two looked apprehensive, but most looked amused. The president was, as always, moving. But he was moving them, apparently mainly, to laughter. What could they be thinking? Were they failing to understand him, or did they perhaps understand him all too well? It was often said of these patients, who, though intelligent, had the severest receptive or global aphasia, rendering them incapable of understanding words as such, that they nonetheless understood most of what was said to them. Their friends, their relatives, the nurses who knew them well, could hardly believe sometimes that they were aphasiac. This was because, when addressed naturally, they grasped some or most of the meaning, and one does not speak naturally. Thus, to demonstrate their aphasia, one had to go to extraordinary lengths, as a neurologist, to speak and behave unnaturally, to remove all the extraverbal cues, tone of voice, intonation, suggestive emphasis or inflection, as well as all visual cues, one's expression, one's gestures, one's entire, largely unconscious personal repertoire and posture. One had to remove all of this, which might involve total concealment of one's person and total depersonalization of one's voice, even by using a computerized voice synthesizer, in order to reduce speech to pure words, speech totally devoid of what Frege called tone color, Klangenfagen, or evocation. With the most sensitive patients, it was only with such a grossly artificial, mechanical speech, somewhat like that of the computers in Star Trek, that one could be wholly sure of their aphasia. And then the piece goes on and talks about aphasia and how they picked up all these clues from the way people spoke, how the way dogs recognize vocal intonations, and what dogs can do here, aphasiacs do too, and at a human and immeasurably superior level. One can lie with the mouth, Nietzsche writes, but with the accompanying grimace one nevertheless tells the truth. To such a grimace, to any falsity or impropriety in bodily appearance or posture, aphasiacs are preternaturally sensitive. And if they cannot see one, this is especially true of our blind aphasiacs, they have an infallible ear for every vocal nuance, the tone, the rhythm, the cadences, the music, the subtlest modulations, inflections, intonations, which can give or remove verisimilitude to or from a man's voice. If one cannot, then, lie to an aphasiac in view of his special sensitivity to expression and tone, how is it, we might ask, with patients, if there are such, who lack any sense of expression and tone, while preserving unchanged their comprehension for words? Patients of an exactly opposite kind. Anyhow, goes on talking about such patients, and among the patients with tonal agnosia on the aphasia ward, who also listened to the president's speech, was Emily D., with a glioma in her right temporal lobe, a former English teacher and poet of some repute, with an exceptional feeling for language and strong powers of analysis and expression. Emily D. was able to articulate the opposite situation, how the president's speech sounded to someone with tonal agnosia. Emily D. could no longer tell if a voice was angry, cheerful, sad, whatever. Since voices now lacked expression, she had to look at people's faces, their postures and movements when they talked, and found herself doing so with a care and intensity she had never shown before. But this, it so happened, was also limited because she had a malignant glaucoma and was rapidly losing her sight, too. What she then found she had to do was to pay extreme attention to exactness of words and word use, and to insist that those around her did just the same. She could less and less follow loose speech or slang, speech of an elusive or emotional kind, and more required of her interlocutors that they speak prose, proper words in proper places. Emily D. also listened, stony-faced, to the president's speech, bringing to it a strange mixture of enhanced and defective perceptions, precisely the opposite mixture to those of the aphasiacs. It did not move her. No speech now moved her, and all that was evocative, genuine or false, completely passed her by. Deprived of emotional reaction, was she then, like the rest of us, transported or taken in? By no means. He is not cogent, she said. He does not speak good prose. His word use is improper. Either he is brain damaged or he has something to conceal. Thus, the president's speech did not work for Emily D. either, due to her enhanced sense of formal language use, propriety as prose, any more than it worked for our phasiacs with their word deafness but enhanced sense of tone. Here, then, was the paradox of the president's speech. We normals, aided doubtless by our wish to be fooled, were indeed well and truly fooled. And so cunningly was deceptive word use combined with deceptive tone that only the brain damaged remained intact and undeceived. This was a section from The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat and Other Clinical Tales by Oliver Sacks, one of the leading clinical writers of the 20th century, according to the New York Times Book Review, published by Summit Books. I commend this book to your attention. It is filled with fascinating stuff, my friends. Let me see. Have I taken care of everything I said? Well, I got another thing here. I'm not going to do this today because I've been 20 minutes into this. I got a piece by Italo Calvino on why we should read the classics, which is absolutely lovely. I just want to give you the address again for the Scripps Howard Foundation in case you wish to get in touch with them and advise them that this program is the most important thing in your life, that it not only helps enforce literacy and spread wisdom and logic, but it cleaned up your zits, helped your marriage along. We want you to do these sort of things. This is all venal on our part. The foundation is going to contribute $5,000 to a literacy project in our community, so it's in your own good interest. That's the Scripps Howard Foundation, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45202. Or give them a call at 513-3037. And that is the Charles E. Scripps Literacy Award for the newspaper or broadcast station that best promotes literacy in its community through sponsorship of a particular program. Some of you letter hacks out there could do well to do this, and instead of sending us a letter this week, and by the way, you're getting out of hand again, please, will you stop with the letters? That is why in this universe, the Big Bang first produced the postcard. Before there was darkness, before there was light, before there was the quasar, the quark, or anything, there was the postcard. The postcard, friends, please. No, I mustn't get that way. Right now, we're going to cut to the scarscape. Yeah, right, the scarscape, where the scarred and damaged and bearing up under the strain of it all, working with me, Terry Hodel, will be happy to speak to you about what is coming up. Terry, take it away. This, my friends, is Hour 25. Mike Hodell's Hour 25. I am your host, Harlan Ellison. On this, my favorite holiday, as it is Ray Bradbury's favorite holiday, apart from Yom Kippur, in which you beat yourself with sticks and apologize to everybody in the world for doing things that you really wanted to do. Anyhow, let's not get into that. This is Halloween. Yes, the very holiday that the creationists and the fundamentalists wish to take away. Yes, there are in fact cities and towns in America where they are trying to pass a law to outlaw Halloween because it is Satanist and demonic. And good gravy, folks, that's what it's all about. Us for more and better gargoyles. I mean, look who's in the White House. We have with us tonight two outstanding personalities. I'm going to pretend that we have never heard of either one of them, when in fact you have. One man has 24 books, I believe, published, 25, 26. Another one is in fact himself a publisher, so he has dozens and dozens of books. And I'm going to let them give you their credentials and laud themselves as fully as they wish. Now, you notice I did not say as fulsomely as we wish, because that would have been incorrect. They are both grammarians. We have both done numbers on irregardless here, so if anyone makes a gaffe this evening, folks, you can send in notes and say, ha-ha, schmuck, you said it wrongly. Anyhow, alphabetically we'll go. The gentleman on my left is David Alexander. The gentleman on my right is D. Scott Rogo. Mr. Alexander, would you please sign in and identify yourself? Give us your credentials.
Well, for 12 years I was a professional magician. After that I worked as a private investigator. I handled all sorts of major cases, criminal defense. I've done investigations of all types. I am a book publisher now, as you mentioned. And I am
Centerline Press.
Centerline Press, that's correct. And I'm also the editor and publisher of the Alexander Review, which is the professional journal for people who are involved in studying and teaching the Alexander technique, which is a movement re-education process. I am on the board of directors of the Southern California Skeptics. I am their magic consultant, not their magical consultant, as some people have described me. Their magic consultant. I am also a special consultant to the Committee for the Scientific Examination of Religion on their faith healing subcommittee.
And I also saw you on Mid-Morning LA just a few weeks ago with three mediums.
Well, 3 psychics, yes.
3 psychics. Now, my familiarity with the terminology may be spotty. If I use a wrong word, I'm sure that one or the other of you will jump down my throat. On my right, D. Scott Rogo, whose hair is exactly like mine. You have the same kind of hair I do. How come yours looks better than mine?
I have no idea.
I don't either. Well, anyhow, your credentials, Mr. Rogo, sir.
Yeah. I am a lecturer in parapsychology at John F. Kennedy University, where we offer a master's degree program in parapsychology, fully accredited. I'm also the consulting editor for Fate magazine, which has been a leader in this country since 1948 on reporting what occurs in the areas of the borderlands of science. I'm also the author of 26 books on the paranormal.
Including the title I love.
Phone Calls from the Dead.
You got it.
Yes.
That's the one I love.
Yes, we're doing the sequel now, Phone Calls from People You Wish Were Dead.
We walked into that, didn't we?
Yes, and the Saturday Night Live version, Phone Calls from the Dull.
Okay, now when we got the idea to do this, it was suggested that I had seen David. I had talked to David on the phone a couple of times, and I'd seen him on Mid-Morning LA. And I said, "There's a bright and personable guy who I think could do a kind of a funny show." And Scott, you were recommended to me, I guess, by Al Seckel, who said, "If you're going to do David Alexander, then get Scott Rogo." And I said, "Okay," because my affiliation. You're gonna hate this, David. And actually, you're not gonna hate it, because you know how far back my association goes with Fate magazine.
I have no idea.
Well, Ray Palmer, who founded Fate
yes.
magazine, was a very close friend of mine. I knew him through science fiction, and he was the first editor I ever submitted to. Ray never bought from me because I was in high school at the time, but we were very, very close, and he was the dearest man in the world. And so I've always had a kind of a soft, warm spot in my head for Fate magazine because of that. But now you two gentlemen are at opposite poles of the faith spectrum, I suppose, in terms of seances and mediums and psychic things. David, I believe, believes not, and you may or may not believe.
Well, I don't think it's opposite spectrums. I think we both have very similar concerns in many ways. We are both against fraud. We both believe that fraud should be rooted out and exposed. I think the difference between us is that after many years of doing research, both out in the field and also conducting experiments at UCLA and other places, I've come to accept that there are some psychic things that occur in the world that are genuine. It is my impression that Mr. Alexander does not feel that anything is genuine. But as I said, we have many goals in common, which is to get to truth and, most importantly, to ferret out and expose fraud.
And David, you're more in line with James Randi, the amazing Randi, who was on this program, that you believe there is not.
Well, it's not a matter of belief. If we look at the etymology of the word belief, it goes back to an Anglo-Saxon word, as I understand it, leaf, which is to wish. I don't want to get into belief systems. I want to get into what one can know or not know via the scientific method.
Absolutely.
And that's basically what I'm looking at. I think one thing that we should go back, the fact that Scott's sitting here and we can talk rationally and we can communicate. From the skeptical standpoint, people tend to think that we view all people who believe differently from us or think differently from us or happen to think that psychic phenomena are real as being evil or rotten or frauds, and that's not true. Many of the people that I've met in the psychic community are very sincere people. I think that their basic premise is wrong or incorrect or not fully examined, or that they have had what I call IOPs, improperly observed phenomena. I don't find
that's my first 4 marriages. IOP,
Really?
IOPs. I had, yes, improperly observed phenomena. That's exactly. I've always
had one of those.
wondered what the proper term for those first 4 marriages was. Hell is what I usually call. That's the
I see.
shorthand. But wait a minute. Look, Tonight, we're not going to do any of that. This is the stuff that you guys do all the time. When we put two similar type people together, we wind up with that, and we wind up with Anglo-Saxon word origins. No, we're not going to do that. Tonight, we're going to have fun. Tonight, we're going to have fun because we're going to talk about seances. And tonight, we're going to do what they always try not to do in forensic debating. No, they never do anecdotes, which are, of course, the best stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
Anecdotes, gossip, salacious remarks about such things. I really have heard some amazing and wonderful stories about crazy things that have happened at seances. I have in front of me a wonderful book that Scott knows called Death and the Magician, which is the mystery of Houdini. It's all about Houdini by Raymond Fitzsimons, and it's a psychological more than anything else analysis of why he did what he did, magic, and in his debunking activities among the seance people and the mediums and the paranormalists. And there was a section here that I wanted to read later, which is wonderful, funny stuff. But I want you guys to talk about it. Scott, what's the most interesting seance story you know?
Oh, there's dozens of them. You'd have to hone it down a little bit.
Okay. What's the funniest? Tell me
the funniest, I think, was actually, it's an anecdote from a friend, a co-author of mine named Raymond Bayless. They're investigating a very overweight psychic in the Southland who did materialization seances. This is a phenomenon where the medium will go into trance. Usually she's sitting in front of a closed area called a cabinet. It can be also done by just putting a sheet across the corner of the room. Well, of course, the lights were lowered, and all of a sudden she'd go into trance. And all of a sudden, the phenomena, the ectoplasm would materialize, and a phantom would form and go running around the seance room. Well, it was actually the psychic's daughter in her bare feet. So for one seance, they came loaded with a little box of thumbtacks, which they very gingerly spread on the floor. And it was remarkable hearing this materialized apparition from the other world going, "Ooh, ow, ooh," as it ran across, visiting from the spirit world.
Okay, now, David, you tell us your favorite funny.
Oh, God, there are several. I believe it was Dr. Puharich who, before he met Geller, had been allowed into...
That was Uri Geller.
Uri Geller, yeah. Right. Before he was allowed into a spirit camp back in, I believe it's Indiana. Chesterfield, Indiana, Camp Chesterfield. And these people were, can you call them crooks? Can you call them frauds? I don't know. But they didn't know anything about science and technology. And he went in with some infrared film and said, "We want to photograph your seances with infrared film." And they said, "Oh, fine, it's great." They didn't know anything about it. When the film was developed, they showed people walking in from a hidden door, doing the manifestations, and walking out again. They were exposed, caught with their pants down. Very, very badly.
What is this? I've heard bits and pieces of the famous Catherine Coleman story about a seance in which Catherine Coleman was supposed to be having sex with a ghost. Oh, don't tell me you two don't know this one. Oh, this.
Well, Catherine Coleman was a faith healer. Are you thinking of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross?
Oh, that's yes, exactly what I'm thinking of.
Very big difference.
Yes. I demonstrate my ignorance. All names that begin with a K.
I could see Catherine Coleman reaching out if the guy couldn't. Well, anyway, and going heal.
No, it's all names with
Rise
a K
up.
are mnemonically the same to me. I'm an idiot savant, as everyone who listens to this show knows for sure. Tell us the Kubler-Ross story, because can you give us the background on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross?
Okay, it's really a very tragic story. You know, we might think it's funny. I consider it more tragic, but in a way, I'm afraid that a lot of it Kubler-Ross brought upon herself. Dr. Kubler-Ross is well known for her work as a death counselor. She helps people, and now especially children, psychologically confront death and psychologically deal with their imminent death. And she's done a great deal of work in that area. She's a really remarkable woman personally. And this... what was not so well known about her is that she has a very deep and abiding interest in the paranormal, based on some personal experiences she had. She got roped into a spiritualist group here in California, and there were a couple...
Here in town or upstate?
No, it's out in the desert area.
Right.
And they were running materialization seances very similar to the type that I just earlier very whimsically discussed with the medium which was out in San Bernardino. It later was found out that these, quote, seances, which were materialization seances, although there's no evidence that Kubler-Ross herself knew about this, that a lot of it was kind of a front for seduction, that the materialized spirits were asking to have sex with the sitters, that the mediums were having sex with the sitters, and that these people, in these incredible throes of gullibility, were doing it. And I said there's no evidence that Kubler-Ross was really participated or really even knew anything about this.
I don't mean to interrupt because it's fascinating, but wouldn't someone, a male or a female having sex with what is alleged to be a ghost, wouldn't they?
Well, the scam would be like, this materialized form is your husband. And would say, oh, yes, there's Johnny. I recognize him now. And Johnny, who was just one of the medium's dupes dressed up, would say, yes, and let's have carnal relations because we are husband and wife.
In front of everybody at the scene?
I believe that they'd go into a back area. I'm not quite sure on this. I tried looking it up before I came here. I couldn't find the material. What is so tragic is that it really did negatively affect Kubler-Ross's credibility. And what is doubly tragic is that many members of the parapsychological community tried to warn Kubler-Ross that the seances were ridiculous, that the spirit guides who were materializing were just confederates of the medium, and she just would not listen.
I want to talk about why people won't believe things when they're. There are people who's still going to Peter Popoff. He's been revealed as a complete and total fraud, and yet there are people who say, I don't care. He's still hearing from
Not
God.
as many as before.
Right. A very
Not
good
as
example is when Mr. Alexander talked about the exposure at Camp Chesterfield. That was done by Puharich and an editor of a magazine called Psychic Observer, Tom O'Neill. And when they exposed and printed all this, the spiritualist community fell away from the Psychic Observer, and actually the Psychic Observer went out of business because it exposed gross fraud at one of their own camps.
Tom O'Neill died of a broken heart
Yes.
because the spiritualist community did not stand behind him as they should have for exposing this sort of thing.
on what
By the way,
grounds?
Camp Chesterfield is still in business,
Oh, yeah.
as is Camp Silverbell in Pennsylvania. Now, I don't know if these particular mediums in this particular area where you can go by sex with a deceased spouse, it was almost invariably sex with a deceased male. This was not just particular to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her group. There have been mediums who have been doing this for years. There have been female mediums who would carry prosthetic male organs to work on widows in their grieving. It's really an obscene aspect of mediumship.
God, it is not as funny as I thought it was supposed to be.
It's incredible exploitation of people's grief.
Well, now, did Kubler-Ross, in fact, have, quote, sex with a...
There's no evidence that there's no evidence she was even aware of the scam, because it looks as though those psychics were really after her to turn over certain properties and monies to them,
see.
and that there's this other aspect, which is usually like a small aspect of a greater con. Usually the psychics will have a number of cons going, and in this case, sex was part of the con. I'm not sure of this, but I think there also may have been children involved.
I'm not sure of the facts on this because I haven't had the time in the
Well, how
last
can
few
they
weeks to look it up, but I think that things started to come apart because they tried to recruit a young woman to participate in it. There were already one or two men participating in it, but they were trying to recruit a young girl to work, and she balked at the process.
Well, but if they were revealed as frauds, why did the police not move in? Why,
This I don't know. It comes to the point of what is evidence, who's going to testify. When you get into something this unsavory, a lot of people don't want to testify.
Yeah.
And again, the whole legalistics, I'm not an attorney, but, if a person willfully agreed, two consenting adults are two consenting adults, whether one's dead or not.
But that is in the form of a contract,
No,
and it's fraud. It's clearly fraud.
No, it is fraud, but again, I don't know where the legal aspects were.
Well, when I was a private investigator, I remember I had a case, not like this at all, but the client was a very nice man who had been very badly duped by some partners, and he was facing some prison time. And I told him very frankly that I developed all of the evidence that would work in his defense, and it was very clear that the man had been very, very badly duped. And I said, you're going to go on the stand and you're going to look like an absolute idiot, a complete and total moron for believing what these people told you, for not listening, for not investigating. And he said, well, what's the alternative? I said, going to federal prison. And he actually had to think about whether or not he was going to get on the stand and be made an idiot when the alternative was prison. So you're dealing with people who, well, that's why the basic premise of why con men are so successful is because you're not going to complain because you don't want to go to the police instead on a stand and testify and look like a jerk, look like a complete idiot. And they live off of that.
They live off that. Off of is double.
That's correct. Thank you. I'll speak gooder English when I leave here, Harlan.
Well, if you hadn't been discussing this before we went on the air, I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be jumping at it. Although I do it automatically. It's a bad habit of mine. Which is incorrect also, because if it's a bad habit, it's the one on which I'm speaking, so it's mine, so that's redundant.
I missed
You
that.
see, it's very difficult to speak as precisely as one would wish.
I know. Try correcting grammar at bars. You get fists thrown at you.
Yeah, and you say, when they say, well, you and me, you mean you and I. Well, yeah, both of us.
Yeah.
I hate that. I hate that. Susan does that to me. I'll catch her on that one. Because she catches me on far more than that, but I catch her on that one, and she does. Shut up. Sit back there and be still.
It's real nice of you.
It's real nice of me.
Nicely put.
At Halloween time, we find. I've always considered Halloween a nice, innocent, wonderful kind of holiday. I know all the origins and all the various things that it can mean, but then that's all subcutaneous, as it were. What is done around Halloween time? Do you know of any great Halloween seance stories?
Not really. This is kind of my busy season, but
Is Halloween a busy season for you?
well, everyone does theme shows, and I kind of go on a circuit of doing theme shows, which I swore I would never do. But then I get called like a month in advance to find out it's airing on Halloween. But Halloween
Seances go on all year round.
Exactly.
The people are out hustling constantly. I remember talking to a fellow who was very big in this, Franklin Lohr, a number of years ago, and was telling me how that the seance where things floated and one thing and another was done it wasn't done in the dark. He was very big on that. Oh, this isn't done in the dark. And I said, really? What's the lighting conditions? What are the lighting conditions? And he said, oh, it's done in red light. Red light. Well, if you know anything about stagecraft, you can run a cable across in front of someone under red light.
Red light,
and
they'll never see it.
It's going to diffuse out. You run a brown thread with red light, and you could be 6 inches from it and not see it.
Yeah.
And some of the things that are available now, you can work under full light conditions, fully lit conditions, and you still can't see the thread.
Now, Lohr was not an idiot.
No.
Well, did he not understand the simple laws of chromatics?
Oh, I don't know. It's difficult to get into these people's heads.
I mean, if you've ever had a 3D comic book, and you look through a piece of red cellophane,
here we're looking at people's motivations. I mean, why are people doing what they're doing? I've heard people say that Geller and other mediums, Eusapia Palladino, who was examined by a group of scientists and found to be, quote, genuine, close quote. She was also examined by Joseph Rinn and a number of other people and found to be totally fraudulent, caught doing things. The justification for that is people come out and they say, well, yes, but her powers deserted her and she didn't want to cheat. She didn't want to disappoint, so she resorted to cheating. And I find that to be unconscionably unethical.
Well, first of all, I'll tell you why I think you're wrong there. Palladino, and I do accept that she had genuine ability. I think the evidence, if you read the original reports, are overwhelming. Not that she didn't cheat, but you're talking about an illiterate peasant woman, and you're trying to say what she did was unethical according to our own highly evolved, college-educated view of ethics. I don't think that you can really apply our concept of ethics to a woman who was a poor Italian illiterate peasant who did anything she could to make a buck, because she had a family to support, a husband to support. I think it's wrong to try to talk about ethics in that terms, because these people came from a very different worldview, a different cultural view, a different cultural world. My favorite story of this is from Arthur Koestler, the great writer, when he went to India. Now, Indian philosophy is very different from Western philosophy, because Eastern philosophy is a lot based on situation ethics, when here a lot of it's based on very rigid moral values. And he kept on asking people if such and such a guru were genuine or fraudulent, and he kind of got quizzical looks. And eventually he realized he was asking the wrong question. It's not, is such and such a guru genuine or fraudulent, is to what extent is such and such a guru genuine, and to what extent is he also fraudulent? And I think you have the same thing with psychics.
No, I'm sorry, I can't accept that about Palladino because, number one, Palladino was at 16 married to a magician. She
That's
was
not
married to
true.
a
No,
traveling magician.
actually, that's a myth. That's not true. He had, in fact, he was a stage manager. He was not a magician. His only magic is he knew a few card tricks, and that's been very well documented in the literature. He was not a magician.
I'll go by what Joe Rinn said.
Well,
in
I'll
his
go
book.
by what all the authorities in Italy on her, who did extensive research on her background, said.
Well,
And
I
he
think
was a
that
stage
becomes-
manager, and that's very well documented in the literature.
Still, whether we accept that point or not, the woman was doing fraudulent things for money. Heward Carrington was on one of the committees to promote her. He brought her to the United States.
He was not
and
on
she
a committee
getting-
to promote her. That's incorrect. He was sent on a committee. He
wrote articles about her and was here to promote her. He promoted her tour in the United States, and she was getting paid $80 a seance.
Okay, now let
which
me-
was a
okay.
lot of money in those
Okay,
days.
again, your
she had
facts
to
are
produce.
only somewhat correct. First of all, he was never on a commission to promote Palladino. The Society for Psychical Research sent 3 conjurers to Italy to investigate impartially her abilities, and they were Everard Fielding, E.E. Bagley, just stuff. However, you'd have to go into the original report to see the detail
Mhm.
of how they rehearsed among themselves how they're going to run these sittings. They had a stenographer there, which had not been done before, to take records of what was going on as each phenomenon occurred. Carrington was very impressed with Palladino and wanted some of the American savants to also have a chance to sit with her. So, in fact, he did bring her to the United States. He did not take part in many of the sittings. They were mostly done at Princeton and Columbia. And he did write articles about her, just as did people such as Hugo Munsterberg, Joseph Jastrow. Everyone was writing pro and con her about her abilities. But he was not her stage manager. He was not, quote, he was not promoting a tour. She was paid for her services, just like you are paid for your services as a private investigator. I am paid for my services lecturing at colleges.
And none of us are being paid for the show.
That's true.
But that's all right.
But again, there's Carrington is a fascinating character in the history of parapsychology. He did some questionable things. He also tried to promote himself in ways other more academic people did not. But he was not a stage manager, and he was not, quote, promoting Palladino, because he himself had written about her fraud.
Yes, that's true. But he also was selling a series of articles to magazines on Palladino and helped promote her tour in the United States.
It was not a tour. He brought her to be researched at various universities.
Well, I think if you check the
I have all the
historical record
I
on
have
that,
them in my library.
Great. Well, if you check those, I think you will find that she was not available for those seances at Princeton for some time because she was taking private seances. He booked her up on private seances very, very heavily, and she was primarily in the United States to do private seances, and the time to do the investigative seances was very, very minimal.
Well, there was a great deal, of course, promotion.
You bet.
From the time, but from the news,
And
by the
she was-
newspapers,
well,
more
she
than
was
anything
making
else.
a lot of money doing private seances in the United States and was not available for the scientific seances very often, if at all, which was ostensibly the reason she was brought
that's
over
nonsense. There were over 20 sittings for the academic communities of
How many
Princeton.
sittings, how many private sittings did she
That
do?
we'll probably never know. The point, though, is she
Well, what happened at these sittings? Describe one of the
Well,
sittings.
go ahead, Scott.
They were typical physical mediumistic sittings. She was a physical medium. In her presence, objects would move around, forms would sometimes materialize, the table would levitate, etc. And for typical sittings, Palladino would be examined by a couple of academics. Then they would sit around a table. The light would usually begin fairly full light, then it would gradually go down to a red light, and then gradually to almost total darkness. And objects would move around. There'd be raps, table levitations.
Well, we now understand that most raps are physically produced. Who was the woman who was cracking her
The
toes?
Fox sisters.
The Fox sisters. They cracked their toes and produced very loud
Which,
raps.
interestingly enough, the historical record shows very clearly that the Fox sisters were exposed almost from the beginning. almost continuously from the beginning. There were doctors examining them, saying, "Well, they're cracking their toes, or they're cracking their ankle bones, and it, like that." People did not pay attention to that.
Not to defend the Fox sisters, but a lot of those quote explanations were found to have been anatomically impossible.
The Fox sisters, where there were at least, Paul Kurtz wrote very recently in his book, the Handbook's
Skeptic's
Handbook to Parapsychology.
To which I contributed also.
Yes, that's true. And
incestuous. This whole thing is
yes,
incestuous.
it's all a kind of a. Anyway, they were exposed virtually from the beginning by doctors, giving very accurate explanations of what they were doing. Cracking the toes, putting the feet next to or pushing them up against tables so the tables acted like a sounding board, and with suggestion, people would feel that the sounds would come from all around the room. A very, very famous character in the late 30s and early 40s, Dr. Edward Saint, who was Mrs. Houdini's manager and close friend, could produce spirit raps and spirit lights in a darkened room with people holding and controlling his legs and his arms. And it was very clever. He was a very clever man.
How did he do it?
How did he do it? At the time, you could buy pulls, luminous pulls, a little disc that you would put on a shade to find it in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
He would secrete that in his mouth. He also would have 3 or 4 BBs in his mouth. And then you could have, or the way he would do it and the way it's written up, you would have 2 people sitting on your legs and 2 other people holding your arms. Mm-hmm. So all of your limbs are controlled. And then he would start talking about, "Oh, do you see something over there in a completely dark room?" And he would spit a BB and it would hit a wall and there would be a spirit rap. And if it was a proper type of rug, you wouldn't be able to find the BB later. If there was a strategically placed mirror, he could make the little pull, the luminous pull, shine when he opened his mouth, and you could see spirit lights in various parts of the room. A lot of it is suggestion. I've sat in several seances, and it is, and I'm sure Scott would verify this, it is somewhat disconcerting to sit in a completely pitch black room for 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes with no reference, nothing to see what's going on. And then when phenomena start happening, it's a mildly disorienting beginning to a seance.
I don't really find it disorienting because I have a very, very keen ear. Just hearing people breathing, I get a very good orientation in the dark. The thing, though, is that most psychics are not nearly as advanced as these type of techniques you're talking about. The repertoire of your standard fraudulent medium is really quite restricted there, because they spend more of their time with psychological manipulation than really using a lot of physical apparatus, which they just don't have access to, and it's not necessary. I mean, it does not take much to convince a person that they're witnessing psychic phenomena. And a very good example of this, of course, some of the research has been done where college professors, I think Barry Singer may have started this, would just give demonstrations and then announce to people that he's doing it, that these are magician's tricks, that's all fraudulent, and a good proportion of a class who've witnessed this after the confession will still not believe that it was not real.
That was done at Long Beach State College, and the fellow came in dressed as a psychic with a long robe and a funny pendant and sandals, your typical mystic garb, and was exposed later. And then he also did the same thing, dressed just in a coat and tie. The thing that Singer was amazed about was the fact that about 50% of the people, after the guy had appeared as a magician doing magic in a coat and tie, believed that he still might have had psychic powers.
You know, this is an extension of, I guess it's at Harvard Law School, where they have a course in being a good witness, or in how to speak to a witness to find out whether they've actually seen what they've actually seen. And in the middle of the class, during the middle of the lecture, someone will come in and will shoot the professor dead with a banana. Have a banana in their hand, and someone will be playing a record, or they will have the sound of a shot, and the guy will fall down dead. Now, after he gets up, then they ask everybody in the class, "What did you see?" And they found something like 3% recognized that the guy was holding a banana and not a gun.
This is a very important point, I think, and it's never really gotten into strongly enough, that people are for the most part, lousy observers.
Yeah.
Very bad, which is not a good description, but they're very bad
How'd you like to be on
observers.
trial for murder and have a half a dozen people at a bus stop as saying, yeah, he's the guy?
Well, that's why we always say that it's very important to have a trained magician, someone who is very, very familiar with the type of workings of psychics and the tricks that can be done, in attendance and watching what's really happening.
Let me tell you what's happening right now. This is the moment at which we announce that this is KPFK 90.7 on the FM dial, Pacifica's gift to the known universe and to various portions of the unknown universe. This is your host, Harlan Ellison, on Mike Hodell's Hour 25. My two guests this evening for a virtually sexless Sex in the Seance room. I mean,
We
you're
can
not.
get back to that.
We need more salacious material here, fellas. On the left is David Alexander from the Southern California Skeptics, and on the right is D. Scott Rogo, doctor of parapsychology.
Yeah, not a doctor.
You're not a doctor.
No.
You're not a doctor.
No, my mother's heartbroken, but I'm not.
Well, whatever you are, you're a lecturer in parapsychology.
I'm a parapsychologist.
You're a parapsychologist, and we're talking about mediums, and we're getting into the interesting area of observation.
It's actually quite interesting that the first experiments on observing psychic phenomena were done by the parapsychologists. Many years ago, at the turn of the century, when the early parapsychologists were getting these glowing descriptions of seances, got very interested in how well people could observe. And there were two series of experiments, one done by a young conjurer named A.J. Davy, and then later on, another group of experiments were done under the direction of Theodore Besterman, both by the Society for Psychical Research, in which literally they brought in clients, telling them they were going to seances, faked the seances, and then compared what really happened at the seance according to the predetermined protocol and what people witnessed. And they were aghast at the discrepancies between the written reports and what they actually knew had occurred, because they had, point by point set out the plan for the seance.
I wish I could be as good a magician as people describe some of the things that I do after they see them. You can go in, you can do something, you can do a little simple sleight of hand trick. People are not trained observers. They're not trained in the particular logic of magic, knowing what must follow. The coin appears to vanish in midair. You ditch it when they're not looking. You can put it in your pocket or pop it up your sleeve or do whatever. By the time they're ready to look at the other hand where it was, it isn't any longer. They do not have enough information to make a rational, to form a rational opinion. They just don't have enough information, because the magician has worked at fooling them. And this, I think, is never brought out strongly enough, and it has to be, because these people are, again, we go back to improperly observed phenomena. They don't have enough information to make a rational judgment.
And this is the whole reason, I think, that eventually parapsychology left the field and went into the scientific laboratory working with non-selected subjects, is it became too difficult. Parapsychology was a cops and robbers affair. Who's going to win, the cop or the robber? And it only ended up with a mass of very hard to interpret material. It was kind of like, the researchers versus the psychics, because in the old days, the psychical researchers were the real villains to the psychics instead of the magicians. That's why I said the whole field eventually became experimental and went into the lab, where it's easier to set up controls. Not that people can't get around those controls, because they do it all the time.
All right, then.
That's right.
All right, let's do this then. I would like each of you must have had an experience that you think is a real one with a seance or a medium or something like that. I presume, and then you found out. Let me phrase it better, because David's shaking his head no. What I mean to say is, I am a skeptic. I've been a skeptic since I was a very small child, and so I never had to get trained in it. I mean, I was always cynical about these things, and yet once someone pulled something on me that I could not see any possible way they could have duped me. Subsequently, I discovered I had in fact been duped, and in fact, when I talked to Randy about it, because it was on the Long John Nebel show in New York,
Yes.
and John was part of it. See, the problem is you begin to trust anybody in these things. You leave yourself open for an alleyway to be flim-flammed. So I have never had. I've had a number of strange things happen to me, in a long life, but it's as easy to find a logical explanation as it is to find some mystical one. And I look at serendipity and I look at synchronicity, and I say those are probably a lot more likely. But I would like each of you. Now, and I think in kind they will be different, because I want the incident, David, where they got you as close to 100% as they possibly could, and then later, either through the interference of someone else, you found out how you've been flummoxed, or how you figured it out yourself. And Scott, I would like you to give me your most unassailable, in your own mind, experience that would lead you to believe. I mean, you say you believe there is such a thing as parapsychological power, and give me the one. Tell us the one that, and of course we only have your word that the conditions were as you say. But you're a bright man, and you'll give us the one that I mean, something must convince you that it exists. All right, who wants to go first on this?
His probably more amusing.
Well, not really, because I've been in magic since I was 6, and very, very, very few magic tricks fool me.
Yeah, but there's always a faster gun. I mean, no matter how good you are, there's always somebody who's sharper, or they've got a new technique.
Several years ago, I was watching one of Doug Henning's specials, and he walks out and he's got a rope trick. He's going to do a rope trick. Well, rope tricks put me to sleep. And I like this. Oh, it's another damn rope trick. Who cares?
How do they do a rope trick?
It's going to be a cut and restored rope, and I see what's happening. You see, this is the logic of magic. I see what's coming, and I'm watching it and I'm going, oh, it's a rope trick. So I was reading a book. I watch TV, reading a book, and I'm not paying a lot of attention. I'm kind of glancing up at the special. I didn't have my video recorder at the time. This is one of his early specials. And I watch this, and I kind of look down. He has 2 people holding a rope, and he walks out, and he cuts it in the middle. And I'm going, ho-hum, to cut and restored rope. Ties the rope, nice little knot in the middle. Fine, great. Everybody knows how to do this. Then he takes the knot and moves it 6 or 8 feet to one side. I go, oh, big deal. And then he unties it. And I was thunderstruck, because now one person is holding a shorter rope and the other person is holding a longer rope. He moved the knot over. He, in essence, moved, and I'm going, what'd he do? What'd he do? Wait a minute. What was that? What was that? Well, pardon me, I was very badly fooled, and the great problem that I had was I hadn't paid attention. I didn't have enough information to reconstruct it, to figure it out. And it was a little while until I talked to some other people and got more information and was able to figure out what he had really done. And then I knew.
But you've never been to a seance where they were so proficient?
Well, let me tell you, I went to a seance in the Oregon area a number of years ago. It was a friend of mine had written a book called Do Not Test Us. And it was his, you know the book.
Oh, yes, that's the one I was talking about earlier, about the experiences.
Yes, yes.
That was the book.
Yeah, I've known Dick for years. So I called him up and I said, what about this seance? He's very nice people. I drove 150 miles one way to have this. He called up, told him I was coming. I went in. Lovely people, just lovely people. Things were not nearly as he described it. He described having these wonderful pictures on the wall that the eyes followed you everywhere. And my wife's a professional portrait artist. I looked at these things, and they were just god-awful, very amateurish. You could just about see the numbers under the paint. They put wooden shutters over the windows, and the room was pitch black, and they did a genuine old-fashioned trumpet seance, which was, I thought, had gone out with button shoes. So they have this collapsible trumpet, and you hear voices coming out of the trumpet and such. And I wanted to talk to my father. My father died when I was very young. And he came back. And I said, what's my father's name? Well, there was no way they were going to know, because their only connection to me was through Dick, and Dick didn't know anything about my family. So I said, what's my father's name? And the guy, and I figured, hey, if it comes across, I'm going to have a heart attack right here. Well, the guy didn't say anything. It came back, you know, son. Well, I've got to tell you that in spite of the fact that there was literally no evidence at all, there was nothing that came across. I mean, they rattled the tambourines, and they did this, and they did that. And, of course, the man and his wife were sitting across from me right next to where the light switch was. So there was no chance in hell that I was going to be able to get up and flip that light switch. There was a powerful, emotional push for me to believe this. I experienced a very powerful, emotional wave, if you will, during this seance and afterwards. Now, they took us out after the seance. They fed us cake and ice cream. There was no charge because these people didn't do it for money. They did it, it was a hobby of theirs.
An elderly couple, if I recall.
Yes, yes, lovely people. Now, my friend, they said, well, what did you think? And I said, well, it was very interesting because you're a guest in their home.
Yeah.
You're not paying anything, and you can't say, this is a bunch of crap. I'm sorry, I can't buy this at all. You just don't insult people in their home when they are not insulting to you.
Yeah.
I was courteous. I was nice. I said, it's very interesting. I had a very powerful emotional, not a catharsis, but a wave overcame me. We left, and there was absolutely no evidence that these people had manifested anything, but the emotion was there. And I think that's important for people to realize, that these many times are not rational judgments that something happened. They're emotional judgments. And people, the mediums and the psychics, play on that.
What about you, Scott?
Well, I've never seen really anything at a seance that really particularly impressed me, because as I said earlier, most professional fake mediums just aren't really very good.
That's right.
They're really not. It doesn't take much insight to if you know just basic conjuring skills. I think, again, the problem is that a lot of researchers think that a basic conjuring skill is all they need when they need a lot more. I think we both agree on that.
Absolutely.
But I have witnessed things during my career as a parapsychologist that are to me inexplicable. Now, some of them have occurred spontaneously. Some of them have occurred in a laboratory setting. I can give you examples from either genre.
Well, give us the one that impressed you most. That's closest to, the subject of the program.
I had been doing a lot of reevaluation of Uri Geller. And to this day, I think Geller was is one of the most enigmatic figures. I think he's going to be the Eusapia Palladino of the 20th century, because everything you read, everything you read about Geller sounds very impressive. Everything I've personally seen with him has been less than impressive. In fact, I'm one of the only parapsychologists who was physically attacked by Uri Geller. He invited me. He invited me to test him, and he did his old routine of trying to get me to, me writing little diagrams around, and he would reproduce them, etc., and I would write something, and he'd go to a corner and reproduce my drawing, etc. Well, he was faking the whole thing. I saw the way he was doing it, so I decided to play games with him by manipulating it, so he thought I was doing and writing things I was not. Well, he got very flustered. Well, finally I decided I was going to leave a loophole so he could fake the way he wanted to fake this little experiment. So so I did fake it. I mean, I let him fake the experiment, which was a method of finally letting him see the top of the pencil when I was making my diagram. And he was claiming he had his back to me. He had his hand over his eye. I could see him peeking. I kept on rearranging his chair, etc. No matter how I rearranged my chair so he could not actually see me, he kept on rearranging his chair. This went on cat and mouse for a while. So I finally let him see my pencil. And he got my drawing. And he showed it to me. He said, "What about that?" And I just looked at him. And I just smirked. And he knew that I knew the way he had faked the demonstration. Well, because this was at a radio station where he had a lot of people around him, he had to make a diversion. So he started throwing every movable object in that room at me, calling me names I cannot really say over the radio. Then after everything was all over, everyone went home, then he came up and apologized for it. Anyways, I had watched him do a metal bending stunt, which was really very impressive. There are so many ways of bending a piece of metal fraudulently that in itself, it was very impressive, but I don't put much stock into it. Several days later, I just written a chapter on Geller for a book of mine on psychokinesis, and I was playing devil's advocate by saying why I thought Geller was fake and why I thought Geller was real at a lunch counter. And I took up a totally straight key, and it was a very, very heavy door key. And I was explaining how Geller was going to fake metal bending. And I picked it up and I said, he stroked it like this. I started stroking it. And as I stroked it and watched, the key bent by 12 degrees. Now, I know I did not bend that key. In fact, I could not physically bend it with my fingers. But as I was actually talking about fraudulently bending keys, as I was stroking this thing in imitation of Geller, the damn key bent by about 12 degrees.
Did it straighten back out? Or is it still bent?
It's bent back at my home. It stayed, and I actually showed it to a couple of physicists who did some tests on it, and they were interested because it bent at a point of the key that would not be the maximum stress point. I won't go into the whole thing about it. But it was very impressive to me because, again, It's only my word to go on, but I know I did not bend that key. And I know it was straight because I had put the key down flat on a table when I was imitating Geller and showing how Geller had faked this one stunt I had seen. So I know it was flat. And when I picked it up and started stroking it, I saw it bend. I put it down, and it did not. It beveled on the table. Now, again, it's only my word for it, but I know I didn't fake it.
A comment on that. I don't believe that Scott's dishonest. I don't believe that he would lie. However, since this is just an anecdote, and it is not in any way, shape, or form scientific evidence,
agreed.
and the
Yeah, but it would
key
scare
was
the hell
not-
out of me if I was...
Well, again, improperly observed phenomena. We do not know that Scott, and Scott, by his own admission, set the key down. Did you do it on both sides, or did you just do it on one side of the key?
It was flat down on the table. Now, if it were bent on any way, it would not lay flat on a table.
Did you roll it?
I didn't. Well, first of all, this was my door key. If it had
Uh-huh.
been bent, I would not have been able to open my door.
Well, not necessarily.
And I said it's also very...
My front door key is
Yeah.
bent, and I can still get inside.
I'll get me your locksmith.
But the thing is that this sort of thing. Now, his comment about Geller, I think, is very interesting, because this is almost the hallmark of the parapsychologist, is that the mice run the experiment.
No.
When you-
Geller ran the session. It was not an experiment. It was not a properly controlled experiment. Let
Good.
me
Okay.
clarify that.
Fine. Then down the road, though, that Geller can say, well, I've been tested by Scott Rogo and this, that, and the other thing. These people have, not these people including Scott, but the psychics have a tendency to inflate things that went on. For example, in one of Geller's tests I think at SRI, when it's printed, when it's written, people read it, it looks like things happened very quickly, and yet when you investigate, you find out that it actually occurred over a 6 or 8 hour period, and that he would go from one experiment to another instead of sitting down and focusing all the way through on one. Recently, some months ago, I did a radio show down in Redondo Beach, and there were some psychics on the program, and they brought a guy in who could bend metal. I said, fine. I brought some metal in, and Seckel brought some. Al Seckel, the executive director of Skeptics, he brought some metal in. I told him what I wanted him to bring. He brought a stainless steel bolt. Now, nobody was going to bend that 2.5-inch stainless steel bolt with their bare hands. If they were, I didn't want to be around them. The fellow took it in his hand and started playing with it, and he held it. And he was squirming around in the chair. And he was admittedly on a rather poorly set up chair. And he was squirming around trying to be comfortable, and he kept moving around, and I kind of had an idea of where he was heading with this. And he squirmed around, and he reached with his right hand underneath the chair to try to adjust the chair. It was one of those swivel-type chairs. And my right hand immediately went out and clamped around his left wrist. And he wasn't helping me. I peeled his wrist over and made him open his hand. Well, the bolt was still there. But I think what he was trying to do, and I have no proof of this, other than my own observations and feelings, I think he was trying to see if he could get away with sticking his hand under the chair and adjusting a little bit, and the second time he was going to do it, he was going to take the bolt down, wedge it in the structure under the chair, and do what he could to get some leverage and bend it, and then bring it back up. I watched his hand for 45 minutes. Now, I talked to people on the show, but I kept my eye on his hand for 45 minutes. Do you know how tough that is?
It is, because I've done that with metal benders too, and it takes an enormous power of concentration. When the Geller phenomenon first hit, you had all these mini Gellers, all the kids running around. And I investigated a number of these metal bending children. I can say that after all those investigations, I did not see one thing that was genuine. I saw a lot of fraud.
Sure.
I saw a lot of deliberate fraud. I saw a lot of kids who really know how to misdirect people's attention. I also saw some stage-struck fathers deliberately promoting the fraud,
Yes.
which was
Yes.
very, very pathetic to watch a really nice youngster about 12 years old who really was not aware of the moral repercussions of what he was doing and being literally set up as a fraud by his own father. One case sticks in my mind on that. But, you have to watch, and it's very hard to keep your focus on anything for a long period of time. And this is what was so amazing about Geller. I don't know if you ever worked with Geller at close range. I have never met a person more masterful in my life of manipulating circumstances around him. This man, I swear, has eyes in the back of his head. He knows everything that's going on. He knows how to misdirect. He knows how to confuse a situation. He is an absolute genius. It's like his mind goes at 300 RPMs to manipulate situations around him. He sizes up people and situations around him. He's really remarkable at that. As I sat with him, even though the tricks he used with me were absolutely childish, the point is, I realized that if it were Geller versus me over a long period of time in an uncontrolled situation, there was no way I could keep tabs on Geller.
That's fascinating.
A number of years ago, when Geller came out here, Al Hibbs of the Jet Propulsion Lab, who is the chairman of the board of the Skeptics, and his friend Richard Feynman, a noted physicist, went over, I think it was a Beverly Hills hotel, to see Geller. They went in. Geller was going to do some metal bending for them. Now, you're dealing with two guys who are pretty sharp cookies in their own right. And while they may not have a big background in magic, they do know that you don't want to lose your concentration. And if I don't know Feynman, but I do know Hibbs, and Hibbs is, if the man can do anything, is very, very good at focusing his attention on the problem at hand. And he tells the story that they watched Geller like a hawk and followed him into the bathroom. He did his little bit, well, I can't bend the key here, maybe we'll do it underwater.
Yeah.
They go into the bathroom. They just followed him like bookends, keeping their eyes, and nothing happened. They were there an hour or so, and nothing happened because they watched him too closely.
But yet, on the other hand, there are other trained magicians who feel that they have witnessed genuine phenomena with Geller.
Oh, yes, but you see, those people, I would say, are not willing to admit that they have a lack of knowledge and are able to be fooled. Now, I freely admit that I can be fooled, but just because I'm fooled, I'm not the final authority. I'm not the guy that's going to put a rubber stamp and say, yes, genuine, not genuine. I want to see that same thing over and over and over and over, because the old line is the first time it's magical, and the second time it's educational.
I think that's a very good point. I think the thing where we do agree is that uncontrolled demonstrations are worthless.
Absolutely.
Pointless. I mean, that is why I said parapsychology went into the lab.
Yeah.
And, someone like Geller, I mean, watching these demonstrations, this is like a prelude to say, okay, let's do things under controlled situations. And I think the main problem, too, with Geller, and this is where I'm going to defend my field, is that a lot of the, quote, scientific research with Geller were done by scientists who had no background in parapsychology, had no background in fraud, had no background in magic, and they were bamboozled, or could have been bamboozled.
Yeah.
And the reports are poorly written.
The possibility was very strongly there.
And
yes.
that, in fact, Geller did very little work in parapsychology labs. He was invited at Maimonides Medical Center to undergo some experiments in both telepathy and metal bending. It was the Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn, their division of parapsychology and psychophysics. They even had Randy come in and go over their protocols, and even Randy was impressed by the protocols. And Geller never showed up. Now, I have read
Smart
a
man.
lot of the reports by a lot of the physicists. There was a whole group of physicists, especially in England, who were doing, quote, research with Geller. Number one, the protocols were flawed. Secondly, their reports were so badly written and published that you really did not have any idea what went on during the experiments. The reports. And this...
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And this is the problem, that we're very aware of in parapsychology, where we're really trying to develop very specific criteria for even reporting experiments so that everything can be unified. In fact, recently the Parapsychological Association has begun working with magicians and passed a resolution to work with magicians. But see, the whole problem there, of course, is that magic, like parapsychology, magic is a whole host of specialties. A man who does card tricks, is a good card person, may not really be very good at judging illusions.
That's right.
And it's really, it comes to a point of, again, pay your money and buy your expert.
Well, look, let me ask you. See, I always try to follow the logical strain. If the techniques and the procedures that they set up at Maimonides were that good that even Randy was impressed, and Geller does not show up, how does Geller explain this, or does he never?
Oh, he explained it. He explained that there was a big strike going on, and that he had to be ushered in through the back of the building, and he just said that he was not treated very well, and he didn't like the way people's attitudes towards him, and agreed the people at Maimonides were parapsychologists don't like a lot of publicity. and Geller's a publicity hound. And they're trying to keep it low-keyed, and Geller felt he was being slighted. It's also not unlike Geller just not to show up for experiments. Geller was never personally very responsible. But he explained to me that he was being railroaded through the back, that no one really believed in his abilities, it wasn't the right attitude, and there was a lot of unnecessary snide attitude towards Geller there, because I was working at that lab at the time.
If we step back to the original premise of this show about sex in the seance room,
I would love that.
I think we kind of beat Yuri to death here.
He has a new book out.
Oh yeah, he's now living in England, I believe, right?
I've always believed, and I've said on the show many times, the two most common things in the universe are hydrogen and stupidity.
Not necessarily in that order.
In that order, the astonishing gullibility of people, absolutely is awesome. I mean, genuinely, in the use of the word awesome, it is staggering to think how ready to be duped most people are.
Well, if we step back and we look at the simple logical premise, if you could contact people who had died, think of the tremendous advances in medicine, in physics, in all that.
Why
to
would
be
they
able to contact these people who had died and have them keep on working.
Yeah, but how do you know that there's not a complete personality disintegration? How do you know that they are again, I think the logic there is very questionable. You're making a lot of assumptions.
Well, I'm saying that mediums who claim to contact dead entities, these entities come back and they're discrete personalities. There are people who come back and they say, yes, I'm Joe Smith. And yet, God, there was a wonderful thing in one of Rin's books, and I can't remember, Mrs. Piper perhaps was a medium. They contacted one fellow who was very well known in that particular time, in that particular area, who spoke classical Greek and who did lots of things, and didn't, when his personality came back through Mrs. Piper or whoever the medium was, he didn't speak classical Greek, because the medium didn't speak classical Greek.
Yet there are
and on and on and on like that.
There are actually many cases, though, where communicators have spoken in languages that were unknown to the psychic. One of the greatest cases was Mrs. Piper, in fact.
They say they were unknown to the psychic.
Well, in the case of Mrs. Piper, just to give an example, there was a famous cross correspondence, and this is where you have two mediums, and you talk to the entity through one medium, and then the entity communicates through the other medium, in which one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research was F.W.A.
As you go along, I said, I'll bet you $100. He said, what? I said, $100. He says, you got $100? Well, I happened to have, and this is not a very frequent occurrence with me, I happen to have a $100 bill on me. I don't know why I was going to pay something, and I whipped out this $100 bill. So I said, put up or shut up, son. And we let one of the women hold the money. And they said, well, how are you going to prove it? I said, I'm going to go over and I'm going to ask them. They said, you're going to go over and ask? You're going to go speak to these people? I said, absolutely. And I said, and I'm positive that from their reaction, you will see whether I've won the bet or not. So I excused myself. My date let me out. I went over and I walked over and I leaned over the table. And I began speaking to the man and the woman whom I had never seen before in my life, very softly, very insinuatingly, just like this. And I said, excuse me, I said, I'm a time motion study expert from UCLA, and I've been watching you folks, and I've made some observations about you, and I just wanted to see if I'm right. Would you mind me intruding for a moment? And for reasons which I will explain to you, I got a yes, and I began explaining. Well, you blah, 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 and he blah, 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 and he's trying to blah, blah, and you're going to blah, blah, and then you're going to blah, blah, blah. And as I talked, the more I talked, the redder in the face the guy got, more and more apoplectic. The woman began to cry. And I mean loudly. And finally, she leaped up, rushed around the table, ran around me, and was gone out the front of the restaurant. The guy rose up as if he was going to pelt me in the kisser. I dropped back because I didn't feel like getting hit. He called me an obscene name, threw down a batch of money and his napkin, and raced after her. I went back, sat down, began addressing my salad again, and said I rest my case. Well, they were dumbfounded. In fact, it was not magic. In fact, it was exactly what is lacking in people who go, it seems to me, to seances. Now, I can describe it to you, what I saw when I looked up, and it will all be very logical to you. Body language, which is what mediums use and what a lot of psychics use and what a lot of con people use, because I worked in a carny. When I was 13, I was working in a carny. Body language tells you volumes about people. When a man and a woman are not familiar with each other and they're sitting together in a restaurant booth, and the people on the radio can't see this, but the women will understand exactly the motion that I'm describing. There is a way in which men lean over and put their hand either on the wall. If it's at a party, they put their hands on the wall to kind of close the woman in so that they have her at their mercy. Or in a booth, the hand goes up across the top and the man leans in. In body language, one who is trying to make the point leans forward. One who is resisting the point leans back. Now, as I watch these two people sitting there, I get the body language. The body language is the man coming on to the woman. The woman she has her head down and she is eating her salad as if it is the only thing in the universe. You understand? And yet, every once in a while, she will look up at him kind of coquettishly or laugh coquettishly. And the guy is taking that as reason to continue going. So I know that, first of all, they are not married. They are not they're on a first date or they're on a first encounter. The woman, during this period, women who worked in typing pools and as secretaries in business offices were, if not required, it was appreciated if they wore short dresses, mini skirts, short dresses. But you would not wear that kind of clothing to go to a restaurant like Lowry's, the Prime Rib, which is on Restaurant Row and is fancy. The guy was wearing a business suit which was wrinkled. His shirt was open at the collar. His tie was slightly down. He had come directly from work. She was wearing the kind of dress which was a day working dress. It was not an evening dress where she would have had time to go home and get dressed and change. So I understood the relationship. But she was wearing the kind of clothing that a woman would wear who was not the secretary of a high executive. Because the secretary for a high executive wears either a suit or a very expensive dress. She dresses along with her boss. He was sitting there and his jacket had fallen open, and the inside, the lining, was that flame red lining that is only used by Harry Cherry. At that time, Harry Cherry's suit was something like $700-800. That means he had to have been an upper-level executive. That meant she wasn't his secretary. How did I know he was married? He had a wedding ring on. A man with that kind of suit, with a wedding ring, probably lived off in the valley. He didn't live in the city. He would have to live in the valley. And if he's a high executive, he probably had 2.6 children, so I was a fairly safe guess saying 2 kids, and saying Woodland Hills was, approximately where he would live. The woman had not washed her hands, and there were black stains on her hands, and I assumed that was either ledgers or Xerox, which meant that he had probably given her work to do, or given her boss to do, to have her do it, so that she would be there after work. And the reason I knew that I also said that he's an attorney or an insurance guy. That was because all the businesses around there, that's what they were. They had come there directly from work. Anyhow, I went on like this, and it was no more involved or complex than that. But when you go to a fortune teller, when you go to certain kinds of psychics, that's what they do to you. And we're getting into now, the subtext of this conversation, which is observation. And is there no unassailable record of a seance where people who were trained observers still came only to the conclusion that this was in fact a proper manifestation?
Well, it depends who you ask.
Yes.
Some researchers say yes. Again, it all comes down, as I said earlier, is controlling your conditions. You have to control every single condition. This is where we probably disagree. I think there are certain experiments where the conditions were controlled.
But some of the best stories and the most spectacular stunts by mediums were done in what I think we could both call uncontrolled conditions. D.D. Home, for example, was never really
Tell us a D.D. Home story.
Heavy. You would know more about that.
No, because
than I.
that was
He
a
was
little bit
never-
before the era of scientific investigations. The only scientific investigations with him were done by
Crooks.
William Crooks. Terrible choice of name, but a very eminent self-employed chemist of the day. But again, a very good example of this would be Hume, because there are certain types of phenomena in the record that is very hard for me to believe you could fake. Period.
Such as?
Well, his self-levitation in a lighted room. This was seen several times. He'd sometimes levitate a few inches off the floor in a completely lit room with multiple witnesses.
Why only a few inches? I mean, if you could levitate, it would seem to me that you could just go right up to the ceiling and bonk your skull.
Well, he claimed to do that in the dark, but I'm talking about what
in the light, yes.
In the light, there are experiments such as that. There's some of the fire immunity, where he would be seen to put his face into an open fire and not burn himself and pick up coals, but when other people went to touch the coals, they would be burned. And he would now, you could say, okay, he had a coating on his hand, or, there are ways of doing this. However, he would sometimes confer the
power?
The power of incombustibility, whatever, to another sitter right in the room, and he would hand the coal to that person. That person would take the coal in their hand. And now you might say, well, maybe the coal's only burning on one side, not on the other, etc. And I know because I used to do some tricks with burning coals. It's very easy to misdirect people with burning coals. I have people swear up and down I've eaten hot coals. It's very simple to do. But
Is that kosher or treif?
Well, I'm Reformed Jew. I don't really I really wasn't concerned with that. And he would confer this ability to others who would hold it, not be burned, yet any person who tried to pick up the coal would be burned. And a lot of this type of phenomena went on. It's interesting that D.D. Hume was never blatantly caught in fraud, but again, the people he was sitting with usually were not really looking for it.
That's
again,
the important thing about Hume is that the fact that almost invariably he would not sit for skeptics.
Oh, that's not true. That's not true at all.
He would sit for strong believers. His great manifestations occurred around believers.
Well, of course, he was a spiritualist. He was in the spiritualist milieu. Remember, this was the day before scientific inquiry into these phenomena. Mm-hmm. But he did sit for skeptics. He did it all the time. Probably the best known would be his sittings for David Brewster, who believed it at the time, then later accused Hume of fraud, but in his own diaries, it came to light after his death. It was very clear that he believed it was very genuine. He was very, very perplexed by it.
You can't call Brewster a skeptic, then.
At first, well, you see, okay, now you see you're getting into if you go to a seance as a skeptic and you come away believing, then according to you, you're no longer a skeptic. I mean, we're getting into a problem there.
Yes,
I got to go with Scott on that.
This becomes a semantic question. Then, if a person goes in as a skeptic, now what is a skeptic? Is a person an educated skeptic or an uneducated skeptic? If a person goes into a seance as an uneducated skeptic and comes out a believer, I wouldn't buy the conversion, that it's a genuine conversion, because they're not basing it on proper information and the proper ability to make a rational decision.
Well, I said I agree
or
with that
observation.
Totally. It's unfortunate, but I think we both have this problem. I know I do. As I read these historical cases of these great eminent scientists who saw these wonders, but there's absolutely no way of knowing just were these people credulous fools? And just because you have a PhD does not make a person not a credulous fool.
True?
Yeah.
Most magicians know that the easiest people to fool in the world are scientists and engineers.
Because they're looking for something very complicated.
Absolutely.
When mostly magic tricks are very simple.
Yeah.
And the children can see through it all the time.
I remember when Geller was first around. We'll go back to Geller for a fast minute. I'll tell you two fast stories about him. One is funny. People were saying, oh, he's got a laser built into his belt buckle. Well, in those days, if he could build a laser into his belt buckle, the guy was being an idiot screwing around with his psychic nonsense. He could have made a fortune in the aerospace industry by miniaturizing stuff like that.
Well, the mirror stacking of lasers, in those days would make it impossible.
Yeah.